Good morning, folks. Welcome to Cornerstone Baptist. And we're in February already, and we're glad to have you joining with us. So many things to try to sort out as the year goes on. We're 2 months from Easter. 8 weeks from today is going to be our Easter services. So those are things to sort out and be preparing for. When my brother was in the business of building dairy barns, there were several times when the farmer was ready to build a brand new huge barn with all the modern benefits of parlors and all of that, but the old barn had to go first. And for some of the farmers, that was really hard. That was where they had spent their lives. That's where they had grown up, you might say, in the barn. And it was still a good barn, but it had to go in order for the new to come in. Sometimes in our own lives, we see things that really ought to change. We see Christ-likeness that we're not living, and something has to go in order to live that. But we kind of are sad to let the old go. And in fact, that's the way we've always lived. That's where we've lived all our lives, and it's hard to see it go. In Isaiah chapter 3 and 4, we see God destroying the city of Jerusalem, actually taking it away in order to, in the future, restore Jerusalem. Last week in chapter 2, we saw God removing Jerusalem's self-respect. God was humbling them. Today in chapter 3, we see God removing their stability. He's making them live on shaky ground, and then he's removing their security. They're not safe anymore. Why is he doing that? So they will turn to him, and so that he can then build a new Jerusalem. This happened at the time, or in the several hundred years after Isaiah, with Judah being taken away to Babylon, Jerusalem being destroyed, then coming back under Nehemiah. We know that story. Nehemiah comes back and rebuilds the walls, and then Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple. And all of those were marvelous things that happened, but Jerusalem was torn down first in order to get them there. And the application really in our lives today is that God is doing some demolition in our lives often so that he can then build something far more glorious, far more permanent. And what's interesting is in the end, when God changes our lives, we say, why did I wait so long? Why did I fight God so hard when he was trying to remove those things that meant so much to me in order to build something new? Let's take our hymnals this morning. Turn to hymn number 61. 61. Almighty Father, you alone are holy. 61. Let's stand as we sing this.
Mighty fortress,
standing as I pray. Father, thank you for reminding us in so many ways that you are God. That so many times in our lives we lose control because we're not you. And thank you for even taking the times of our being out of control to remind us that you are in control. I pray that we would follow you, we would obey you, we'd trust you. I pray that we would turn from our sinfulness when you point it out to us. And I pray that we would run to you for protection and security and stability. I pray that we would then offer that to the people around us as we see them floundering, as we see them in their lives crashing and burning and making a mess out of things. I pray for America. I pray for its leaders. I pray for each one of us as we reflect you, that you would draw us to you as well as spreading the gospel through our testimonies each day. And then, Lord, as we watch very possibly our towns, our cities, our state, our nation, that you allow to destabilize, that you allow to be humbled, humiliated, that you allow to have our security gone because we've looked somewhere other than you. I pray that you would use your word and use our testimony to point people to you and the glories of your creation, of your work in our lives, of your salvation. Thank you for being our salvation. Guide our morning as we think about you, as we worship you, as we then look for ways to then serve you this week. I pray that we would honor you in all. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. So a few announcements. Dick is junior church meeting on today at noon. Okay, so that is not on today at noon. Leaders meeting tomorrow. I did not get that in the bulletin, so you leaders that are here would love to see you tomorrow. Pray for us, by the way, as we try to navigate the unknown of ministry in a time when we don't even know how we can minister. One of the applications of that would be Easter. So just 8 weeks from now, we love to do a lot of singing on those special services, and we're probably not supposed to that day. We'd love to have a church building full. We probably shouldn't that day, so some of the applications of that already that we can see are, we're going to have to do two services, two identical services that day. We'll let you know on the times of that, and then we'll sign up for earlier or later. Most likely, I think what we're going to try to do is have a bunch of special music, but it will be pre-videoed, almost like we did last year when we were just doing it online. And then we'll show the video up here, and then we'll have a couple or three people reading scriptures and stuff scattered across the stage. All of that will have to be pre-recorded in order to splice it together for the online video. So we'll do that ahead of time, and I will splice it all together that week, and then we'll post it online. But then here, the readers will be live, but the singing will be, that's kind of how we're looking at it right now. But pray for America, pray for our world, pray for wisdom for we leaders. This week, a couple different things. Make sure to get your offering for the college students to Betsy, Candy, or Deb. We want to hand them cash, get them that cash by next Sunday for the college students. And then also for next Sunday, you have the insert about the treats, the treat swap. Just what we need is more sugar.
It can be baked goods.
The baked goods, yeah.
Bread.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Once again, remind you to check the sign-ups for snow shoveling when, like this week, there wasn't enough to to plow, then we need to get the ramp and the steps shoveled off and all. So check on that, and then also check on the sign up for church cleaning. Appreciate all of those who are involved in those things and in your involvement serving the Lord in these ways. Our missionaries this week are Travis and Becky Gravely. They have a unique home office ministry with Baptist Mid-Missions. They are in charge of two different directions in ministry. One is they are called church relations, which means that they are supposed to know all about each of the supporting churches of the missionaries, and they're the frontline people connecting with us with Baptist Mid-Missions. But then they're also recruitment and training of new missionaries. And it's been difficult this last year to get into colleges when they're not supposed to travel and to be recruiting and training. So we'll pray for the Gravleys throughout the week. Any other questions or announcements? Yeah.
Cecile's birthday is tomorrow, so if somebody thought of giving her a call, that would be good.
Okay, Cecile, birthday tomorrow. She's been here the last couple of weeks, but not today. But give her a call tomorrow. I'm sure she would appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Isaiah chapter 3. We'll deal more with the background information in a few minutes. The chapters 2, 3, and 4 are one unit. And in Hebrew poetry, it's kind of interesting how they set things up a lot of times. And Isaiah set up this section, chapters 2, 3, and 4, with this glorious vision of the New Jerusalem in chapter 2, verse 1 through 5. And then he ends in chapter 4 with the glorious vision of the building of this New Jerusalem. And then in between is actually the demolition of the old, and how the old has to go in order for the new to come. We dealt with chapter 2 last week. Let's start with chapter 3. It'll take us a few minutes, but let's read through this passage so we get a feel for it. Isaiah 3, verse 1, "For behold, the Lord of hosts, doth take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, the whole stay of water, the mighty man, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the prudent, the ancient, the captain of 50, the honorable man, the counselor, the cunning artificer, the eloquent orator. And I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. And the people shall be oppressed, every one by another, every one by his neighbor. The child will behave himself proudly against the ancient, the base against the honorable. When a man shall take hold of his brother of the house of his father, saying, You have clothing, be our ruler. Let this ruin be under thy hand. In that day shall he swear, saying, I will not be a healer, for in my house is neither bread or clothing. Make me not a ruler of the people. For Jerusalem is ruined, Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. The show of their countenance doth witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. Say ye to the righteous that it shall be well with him, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hands shall be given him. As for my people, children are the oppressors. The women will rule over them, and my people, they which lead thee, cause thee to err, to destroy the way of thy paths. The Lord standeth up to plead, and standeth to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people, and the princes thereof. For you have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses. What mean you that you beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor, says the Lord God of hosts. Moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, making a tinkling with their feet, Therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion. The Lord will uncover their secret parts. In that day the Lord will take away the bravery of their tinkling ornaments around their feet, and their cauls and their round tires like the moon, the chains, the bracelets, the mufflers, the bonnets, the ornaments, the legs, the headbands, the tablets, the earrings, the rings, the nose jewels, the changeable suits of apparel, the mantles, the wimples, the crisping pins, the glasses, the fine linen, the hoods, the veils. It shall come to pass that instead of sweet smell there will be a stink, instead of a girdle, a tear, instead of a well-set hair, baldness, instead of a stomacher, the girdling of sackcloth, burning instead of beauty. Thy men will fall by the sword, thy mighty in the war. Her gates shall lament and mourn. She, being desolate, will sit on the ground. In that day 7 women will take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own bread, we will wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach. In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. And it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion, he that remaineth in Jerusalem, shall be called holy, even every one that is written among the living in Jerusalem. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, shall have purged the blood of Jerusalem from the midst thereof by the spirit of judgment, by the spirit of burning, the Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion and upon her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day, the shining of a flaming fire by night. For upon all the glory will be a defense. And there shall be a tabernacle for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, for a place of refuge, for a covert from the storm and from rain. And we'll talk about this in just a moment. But first, let's take our hymnals again. Hymn number 595. 595. This is kind of a story of the salvation process. And what we're trying to do with this song is look ahead at the glories ahead of us that come because Jehovah is our salvation. You can remain seated. One day when heaven was filled with his praises, one day when sin was as black as could be, Jesus came forth to be born of a virgin, dwelt among men, my example is he. Living he loved me, dying he saved me, buried he carried my sins far away, rising he justified freely forever. One day he's coming, oh glorious day. One day they led him up Calvary's mountain, one day they nailed him to die on the tree. Suffering anguish, despised and rejected, bearing our sins, my Redeemer is he. Living he loved me, dying he saved me, buried he carried my sins far away, rising he justified. One day he's coming, oh glorious day. One day the grave could conceal him no longer. One day the stone rolled away from the door. Then he arose, over death he had conquered. Now is ascended, my Lord evermore. Living he loved me, dying he saved me, buried he carried my sins far away, day the trumpet will sound for his coming. One day the skies with his glory will shine. Wonderful day, my beloved ones bringing. Glorious Savior, this Jesus is mine. Living he loved me, dying he saved me. Buried he carried my sins far away. Rising he justified freely forever. One day is coming, oh glorious day. I can't wait. So let's go to Isaiah chapter 3. Isaiah chapter 3. Again, the picture is tearing down the old sinful Jerusalem in order for God to build a new Jerusalem. I want to take a few minutes talking about the background of this building process. I'm just basically looking around here in Isaiah, especially chapters 2 through 4, trying to get our bearings. Isaiah prophesied primarily to the southern kingdom of Judah. Remember, the northern 10 tribes were called Israel. Southern kingdom was called Judah. It was Judah and Benjamin. But Isaiah is prophesying primarily to them. The capital of the southern kingdom was Jerusalem. So when you see Isaiah refer to Judah and Jerusalem, he's talking to the people as a whole, Judah, and then Jerusalem would be its leaders. He warned of coming judgment. He does talk, and as the chapters go on, we will see some of Isaiah's warnings to not only the northern kingdom, but also to neighboring nations, pagan nations in the area that God is warning about the coming judgment. The northern kingdom was going to be destroyed, taken away by Assyria during Isaiah's lifetime, around 700 years before Christ. But then Babylon would come after Isaiah's death and would take away the southern kingdom in the future. So a lot of what we're reading here has application for later, after Isaiah dies, of Babylon coming and destroying Jerusalem in order for God to then restore it later. Now, there are future pictures here as well, and we'll see this over and over through Isaiah, where some of the fulfillment of the prophecy was in the past with Assyria, with Babylon, and all of that. Some of it was Jesus coming the first time as the Messiah, as the suffering servant. But then a lot of it looks forward to the future, and it has not been fully accomplished yet. So we will get to more of that as the book goes on here. Chapter 1 was a single sermon that Isaiah preached about this rebellion of Judah against God and the horrible problems that were coming because of it. The nation was broken because of the rebellion against God. We can learn from that as we look even at our own nation, that as we rebel against God, God allows us to go our own way, and it does not look very pretty. Then chapters 2, 3, and 4 are about God building a glorious future kingdom. It has bookends, and remember that is one of the things we look for in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, is this glorious future city filled with people. And then in chapter 4 that we read this morning is the building process of this future city. And then in between describes the demolition process. Again, last week we saw God humbling the city. And then this week we will see God really destabilizing and taking away all of the support of the city. And it was going to fall down. Just again, a little more review of that. The completed city is in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Kevin is building a log cabin right now for a customer, and there's blueprints, and you lay it all out. often with blueprints come these artist's conception. You ever see those? The artist's conception, it shows people walking up and down the sidewalks and looking out over the lake, you might say, and here's how it might be decorated. Well, that's kind of what God is doing here. He's given us a picture of this glorious future Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem. And as he draws this picture for us, we are just saying, wow, what we have now is worthless. We might as well let God destroy it now so we can start the building process. To go back to my little brothers building dairy barns, they would have this picture in their minds of this 100-foot by 400-foot barn with cows coming in and out, and off on the corner would be the parlor and the holding pens and everything. And the farmer would say, that's exactly what I want. Let's light a match to the old barn. And some of them did. And it would be a glorious fire that they would have before they would build. And all that would be left was a few pieces of scrap metal in the ashes. But that was important. It was necessary in order to build new. And at the end of this first section here in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, Isaiah, he sees this picture. And he says, what a beautiful picture. Come on, let's do this. Oh, house of Jacob, come on, let's walk in the light of the Lord. And he invites them to this glorious picture. But then he points out chapters 2 and 3, there has to be some demolition first. So last week we saw in chapter 2, there was the removal of self-respect, or the removal of pride in this building process, where God is saying, look, things are so bad. Things are so bad that people, men, and their idols are going hiding in the rocks, in the caves, trying to hide from God, trying to hide from the demolition process. That's how bad it is. And really the point is, wouldn't we want to let God do that so that we can quickly allow him to rebuild our lives? But then we come to chapter 3, and we just say, okay, now what? What do we see here? Well, let me point out a few things before we go further. When does this happen? When do these things happen? Chapter 2, verse 2, it says, in the last days. Chapter 2, verse 11, the end of the verse, in that day. And then it's also in verse 17, verse 20, chapter 3, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 18, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, in that day. Well, what day? Well, it's the day in verse 12, chapter 2, verse 12, the day of the Lord of hosts is the day we're talking about. In the short term, this would be Jerusalem being destroyed by Babylon and then being restored after the captivity under Nehemiah and then the people that came after Nehemiah. But these road signs, these signs of that day or the last day, point us to the future, a future that has not been fulfilled yet, a future that will be fulfilled in the tribulation time and in the future millennium. Now, there's a few other things I really haven't made sense out of. Again, Hebrew poetry is so foreign to us. But as you look through the newer translations that have poetry set off from the prose, I haven't quite figured out why, say, chapter 3, verses 18 through 23 is set off as prose, or why chapter 4 is set off as prose instead of as poetry. So I don't have an answer for you on that, but that's okay, I guess. It just shows that I don't know, and God does. Another observation in chapter 3. Notice chapter 3, verse 1 starts out with the Lord of hosts. And then that section goes down through verse 15 that ends with the Lord God of hosts. So that is a bookends type of section that says, okay, in between this, something's going on. And So those are the types of road signs we look for. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily help us understand anymore. But just keep your eyes open as we read Isaiah for this kind of road sign. So in chapter 2, it was obvious that God was taking away, was leading his people to humility. He was taking away their self-respect. He was removing their pride. He was humbling them. But then we move on in chapter 3, and notice in verse 1 of chapter 3, the Lord God takes away, here we are again, God is taking away the stay and the staff. Well, what in the world does that mean? A stay is a prop or a support. The staff would be the supply, the shepherd's staff, how he's feeding and leading his sheep. And God takes away those things. So God is willing to humble us. God is willing to take away our self-respect if necessary to cause us to trust in him. And God is willing to take away our stuff. He's willing to take away the things that we rely on in order to bring us to the place where we'll trust him. Verses 1 through 15, as I've already pointed out, is one section. And God is removing the stability of Jerusalem so that he can rebuild. In verse 16 and following, he is removing the security, what they trust in for security. So stability and security that God is removing. Verses 1 through 7, it just describes this whole process. It's interesting how God takes away support and supply means. It's interesting that stay and staff in King James, or support and supply in some others, is the same word, only it's masculine and feminine in the gender, and it just got to mean everything you've relied on. So from the men to the women to everything that you've relied on, God is taking it away. Well, what does he take away? Verse 1, he takes away the basic necessities of life, food and water. How much of it? In the end of verse 3. The whole of it, all of it. God takes away it all. Have you ever felt like you've lost it all? Well, God says, yeah, I'm going to do that. Verses 2 and 3, he removes all the leaders. You know, all of these descriptions, the mighty man, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the prudent, etc. God takes away all of the leaders, the military leaders, the legal leaders, the religious leaders, the social leaders, the business leaders. God is taking them all away. And then in verse 4, God replaces them with weak and inexperienced leaders. Children, babes, are then ruling over them. People that don't have a clue what they're doing are ruling over them at this point. That is part of God's process of destabilizing Judah. And God uses that same principle today in our lives, where he will take away the wise leaders if necessary to bring us to the point of faith in him. Verse 5, they result in having this whole culture, a society of oppression. People will be oppressed by each other. Your neighbor is going to take advantage of you. Lawlessness, anarchy. Everybody's going to do their own things. The child's going to, it's fun how the King James puts it, the child will behave himself proudly against the ancient. It's a child disrespecting the older people. By the way, you may notice that a few of these things are true of America today. God isn't talking about America, but the principles certainly are reflected in what we're living right now, where God is allowing us to be destabilized, to bring us to the place where we may be willing to trust in him. Verse 6 is interesting. Leaders are chosen just because they have nice clothes. Hey, you have some clothes. Why don't you be our leader? Now, one of the jokes that we pastors have with each other is is the candidating process for pastoring. He's got a nice suit. Let's hire him, you know. And it's kind of a joke, but this is reality in verse 6. But notice what happens in verse 7. The guy says, no, forget it. I'm not gonna be the leader. I'm not gonna run for office. By the way, I think we're noticing that in America too. That people aren't willing to run because they're just going to be destroyed. What little they have is going to be destroyed. No, I'm not going to be a healer. I can't fix this thing. You expect me to fix Judah? I can't fix this. No, I'm not going to be your ruler. And all of that destabilizes Judah. Again, it's written to Judah. Chapter 3, verse 1, Judah and Jerusalem and Judah. But it does apply to where we are today. It applies to any nation that turns their back on God, that rejects God, rejects God's leaders, rejects God's principles. There's going to be instability as these things are taken away. A nation that leaves God leaves a stable foundation to build on. Well, why does God do this? Well, look at verse 8. Jerusalem is ruined, Judah is fallen because. There's one of those road signs that you can look out for. Look for the becauses, look for the therefores, that type of thing. So because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord to provoke the eyes of his glory. Both what they say and what they do is in rebellion against the Lord. And then because they display it openly, verse 9, the show of their countenance, they're just showing on their face their rebellion. And it bears witness against them. You ever seen somebody like that? Who, Junior, did you do this? I didn't do that. But it's written all over their face. And God says it shows all over your face your rebellion against God, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Woe to their soul, verse 9, for they have rewarded evil to themselves. Woe to them. Their judgment's going to be terrible. And next week in chapter 5, there's going to be a whole series of woes that we see pronounced because of the sin of Judah. So what can we do as believers if we are living in a society like this? Was there any hope? Was there anything to do for the believing Jews in Jerusalem? Do we just live in fear? Do we run to the rocks like we saw in chapter 2? Well, chapter 3, verse 10 goes on to talk about this duty of believers in light of coming judgment. First, they should encourage and reassure the righteous people. Say to the righteous that it will be well with him, for they will eat of the fruit of their doings. God rewards righteousness lived in faith. Remind each other of that. This is something we can do with each other today, 2021. Tell each other, God rewards righteousness lived in faith. Well, what else could we do? Well, we could, in verse 11, warn the wicked and the rebellious. Woe to the wicked. It will be ill with him. The reward of his hands will be given to him. They will have earned their own judgment. Verse 11. Verse 12, immature leaders will oppress them. Children will be your oppressors. By the way, that's been coming for several decades here in America, where we have the youth being worshipped and wise older people being shoved aside. Now who's in control of the agendas? Children are the oppressors. Women are ruling. The people that they're leading are going to cause you to go astray. They're leading you the wrong direction. And God says that's part of the judgment. And we as believers, righteous believers, have a duty to warn them. Verse 10. Say to them, say these things publicly. But then unwise women will lead them astray as well. Well, Then in verse 13, what happens? The Lord stands up to plead. This is the courtroom picture again. So God is standing up both as the prosecuting attorney and as the witness and as the judge. He stands up to plead and he stands to judge the people. This is the Lord's case. You have judgment coming. You deserve judgment. I have to judge sin. Why? Because they'd abused the vineyard in verse 14. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients, with the older people, with the princes, because, or for, you have eaten up the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. Interesting. Sometimes you bring an accusation against somebody. Look, you've destroyed it. You've robbed from those people. You've oppressed them. And you say, I haven't done anything. Well, your houses are full of the stuff you stole from them. And that's right there in the end of verse 14. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. There was the very, maybe I'll tell a little story. The evidence was on their faces and in their houses. So in the dorm, pastor wasn't always the good little boy that I always am now. Always am now, you know. But, so this is back in the olden days. And remember the big records, the vinyl. And you take a vinyl record case and you'd fill it full of shaving cream. And you'd shove it under somebody's door and then you'd stomp on it. And it would just go everywhere in there. So then they'd come to the door and open it, and then you'd have the baby powder and you just shoot it in their face. And then you'd run to your bed and jump in bed as if nothing had happened. And then you hear the RA coming up the hall, knocking on each door. And then everybody's in bed. And then some people have white powder all over their face. I don't know anything, but that's what's going on here. And isn't that true of us? That often God puts his finger on something in our lives, like he's doing here. And he says, the evidence is right in your houses of the wrong that you've been doing. Well, this is what's going on. And then they've been taking advantage of the people in verse 15. They've not only stolen their stuff, but they've been grinding the people to pieces, stomping on them, so to speak. It could be literal, or this could be figurative, but either way, it's wrong to use people, to stomp on people, to cause yourself to be lifted up and to make yourself feel bigger than you really are. Now, who does this? Well, it's the Lord of hosts who is saying all of this, the end of verse 15. So a brief observation. An unstable nation. And I believe we're observing America becoming more and more unstable as the years go by. An unstable nation is both cause for judgment, because we've rebelled against God and we've left his principles behind that are principles of stability. We've left that behind. That means God has to judge us. But an unstable nation is also part of the judgment. That God says, okay, you want to remove my stable principles? Okay, but you're going to suffer for it by being unstable. And unstable nations abuse each other. And it's not a very fun nation to live in. So how does God judge? Often by just letting nature take its course. By letting sin run rampant. And that's what's going on. But then starting in verse 16, God starts listing out another kind of judgment, and it's the removal of security, I'm calling it. Notice who he's aiming it at are now, in verse 16, the daughters of Zion. The daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with stretched out necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, making a tinkling with their feet. Now, I'm not going to try to even make sense of all of these idioms, the figures of speech that were used 2,700 years ago. I can't even figure out some of the new figures of speech in 2021. You hear somebody say something and you say, what in the world does that mean? Or sometimes you think you know what it means, but they mean something totally different by it. So I'm not going to try to make sense out of all of it. But it's interesting that the Lord doesn't just remove their leaders, their ineffective leaders, but now he's focusing on taking away stuff. These next verses, he's taking away everything that they've treasured. All of the stuff they've trusted in, God takes away from them, and he's removing their security. A comment, I believe the Bible teaches, or I know the Bible teaches, Genesis 1, that God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he them, male and female created he them. And there is a difference, there's a distinction, not in value, but in how God has wired us. Males tend to be proud of their position. So go back to chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. The mighty man, the judge, the warrior, all of those things. The male is proud of his position, and he's flipping his lapels up and saying, look at me in my position. And they find security in their power, in the power they have over others, or in their position of authority. Women, females, tend to be proud of their ability to attract attention through how they look, through how they dress, through how they tinkle their feet. Again, whatever that means. but there it is. They find their security in being attractive to men. And their ability to get a guy for their own. And it's going to be interesting in chapter 4, verse 1, how we see there's going to be so many men killed in battle. 7 ladies are going to be fighting over the same guy, trying to attract his attention in order to get his name. And it's removing their security, the things that they've trusted in. So God judges males by taking away their position. They lose their job, or they lose a position of authority. They lose their power. God judges females by taking away their security and maybe even the beauty they once trusted in. And I don't think I'm stretching that too far by reading these verses in this way. But understand, God is willing to do what it takes to help us to trust him only for our security and stability. Notice the sins causing the judgment. Verse 16, they're proud, they're haughty. They walk with stretched out necks. They're flirting, you might say, with men. They're trying to attract attention. We might say they're strutting their stuff today. Immodest behavior, immodest dress. Everything about them screams, hey, look at me. Your attention, please. And again, 2 brief comments about this in verse 16. They called themselves the daughters of Zion. They called themselves part of Jerusalem, part of God's holy city. They called themselves believers, but yet they're trusting in their ability to attract attention. They're sinning in the process. And by the way, we have this conversation. Don't blame the other sex for your ungodliness. Men, don't blame females in the way they act and dress for your ungodliness. Females, don't blame men. Take responsibility for your own sin. Sometimes women say, if only men would just step up to the plate and do their job. And you know what, ladies? You're right when you say that, because often we men don't. But sometimes we men, blame ladies for stuff as well. Jesus talking to Peter in John chapter 21. Remember, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus had died. Jesus had resurrected. Now they're standing on the lakeside. And Jesus says, hey, Peter, come here. Do you love me? And they went through that little conversation. And Peter said, I like you. You're my friend. No, Peter, do you love me? Nah, yeah, I'm your friend. Peter, do you even like me? And Peter said, yeah, you know I love you. And then Peter still is saying, but what about him? And he points over to John. Aren't we like that? That we often point to other people rather than taking God's finger on our own lives and responding in humility. So God takes away from us in judgment in order to rebuild. Well, what does he remove? Starting in verse 17, there's all sorts of lists here. They have sores on their heads, verse 17. They're uncovered. The end of verse 17, God will uncover their secret parts. Stripped naked. Very possibly, speaking of rape, that their enemies will abuse them. I'm not going to say that dogmatically. I don't really know exactly what God means, but they're at least uncovered. They're going to lose their jewelry, their wardrobe, their perfume, their gowns. Everything of value is going to be taken away from them, those next few verses there. But then notice in verse 24, it kind of comes to a head. And there's a series of insteads in verse 24. It shall come to pass, instead of sweet, there's going to be a stink. Instead of a rope or a girdle, there's going to be this sash, just a torn piece of cloth around them. They'll be bald instead of having well-set hair. They're going to be wearing sackcloth instead of a rich robe. They're going to be branded with shame instead of beauty. You might say the end of verse 24, burning instead of beauty. You might even say they're going to have a number burned into their, tattooed into their skin, whatever. It's going to be a shameful thing, not something they're proud of. Verse 25, they're going to be widowed. Verse 26, they're going to be exiled. Her gates will lament and mourn. She, being desolate or exiled, will sit on the ground. So Jerusalem's gates are going to be empty. There's nobody going to be going in and out. The city's going to be empty. It's going to be destroyed. They're going to be exiled. And they're going to be sitting there saying, what in the world happened? Then in chapter 4, verse 1, there's going to be this competition for husbands. 7 women are going to be grabbing one guy. We're going to grow our own food. We're going to make our own clothes. Just marry us so we can have your name. What desperation comes when we don't trust God, obey God, and God humbles us. God takes away our stability. God takes away our security. And we're left begging. And it's just such a pitiful picture that we see. Trying to figure out the history of this, and you can go back into 2 Kings, say 17, 18, 19, 20. You'll get the historical account of this time. Jeremiah came after Isaiah. You can read him. You can read Lamentations of the fall of Jerusalem back well over 100 years later. All of this came true. Everything that Isaiah is talking about came true. What is the principle for us today? Again, our names are not in here. Make sure you understand this is written to Judah, Jerusalem. But then also be listening in, just like you hear the teacher talking to somebody else, and you overhear what they're saying. You're learning in the process, and you're saying, I don't want to suffer that way. So what should I do? How should I respond? God is willing to take away our stability and our security if we don't trust him. He's only able to do that in order to make us to trust him. Maybe you become, as Dad used to say, too big for your britches. You're just proud, you're haughty, you're rebelling against God, you're running to false gods for security, for comfort. You're trusting in your paycheck, you're trusting in your bank account, You're trusting in your abilities to either earn a living or attract attention, and God takes it away. One of the interesting things and a good question for us to ask is, how do I know when I'm trusting in these things instead of in God? One good way to tell is, what do we do? How do we respond when God takes it away? So, say at the beginning of a new presidential term, how do I respond to that? And I've been around a few presidential terms. I can remember when President Carter was elected. And Mom and Dad said, it's not going to be pretty. But God's in charge. And those years were not fun at all for Dad. And those of you who lived through those mid-70s, mid to late 70s, 20% interest rates, and trying to run a business on that was not fun. But through all of that, Dad did not point at that. God pointed at God and said, I'm trusting God, not my stuff. And God can take away the farm if he wants to. God can take away my health if he wants to. But I'm going to trust in him. And that's a good thing for us to consider. What happens when God takes away our self-confidence, our pride, our self-respect even? What happens when God takes away our stability? What happens when God takes away our stuff and our security? Well, hopefully it causes us to look at something far more glorious in the future. To say there's something far more glorious than this bank account or this house or whatever it is. And then God goes in verse 2 of chapter 4 and describes the building of this glorious new city. The time of the rebuilding, verse 2, in that day. Again, in the short term, it would have been the rebuilding of Jerusalem after the return from Babylon. But really, its ultimate fulfillment is still in the future day of the Lord. The tribulation time followed by the millennial kingdom of Christ's rebuilding. There are applications to Judah and Jerusalem. There are applications to us today. The person doing the rebuilding, the branch of the Lord, so the branch of the Jehovah, will be beautiful and glorious. So the branch is Jesus himself. We will see that very clearly laid out. Chapter 11, verse 1. You can go to Jeremiah, you can go to Zechariah. Just look up the cross references in your study Bibles and you'll find the branch is Jesus. This theme builds as we go through Isaiah and through the other prophets. This branch, Jesus, restores and he rebuilds through his work as Messiah. He is the Messiah. And again, that will be building in our understanding as we go through the book of Isaiah. Jesus ultimately paid the price for our redemption that we saw in chapter 2 by dying in our place. And he saves us through our faith in him. So the person doing the rebuilding is the branch, Jesus himself, and then the Lord Jehovah. Through these verses in chapter 4, there are both Lord capital L, all caps, and then there's Lord with small capital L and then small O-R-D. The small L, O-R-D is like Master, Adonai, Lord, and then the capitals are the Lord Jehovah. They're both used here in chapter 4. He's the one doing the rebuilding. Verses 3 and 4, the subjects who will be living there. He that is left, he that remains in Zion, he that remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, even everyone that is written among the living in Jerusalem. They are God's chosen, preserved remnant. Next week in chapter 5, we're going to see this vineyard, which is Israel, be destroyed. But there's this shoot that comes up. We don't see it here in chapter 5, but that's the picture in the prophets of a shoot coming out of Israel, regrowing. And it's God's preserved remnant. Notice it's those left in Zion, they're called holy. So God has preserved a remnant of holiness that are trusting in God. And then this picture of being written in among the living in Jerusalem. And the terminology runs through Scripture. And sometimes it's used of this remnant of Israel. And then sometimes it's used of those whose names are written in the book of life. That's a different book. And that is those who have trusted Christ for salvation. Notice they are God's washed and purified remnant in verse 4. The Lord, again, who washes away the filth? Do you? No, the Lord does. The Lord washes away the filth. The Lord purges the blood of Jerusalem from the midst. Again, God does this. God refines them through judgment and burning in verse 4. So the people who will be living in this future New Jerusalem are the ones who God has preserved, who God has saved through his power. And then we have verses 5 and 6. The Lord will create on every dwelling place of Mount Zion, this New Jerusalem, on our assemblies, a cloud and smoke by day, the shining of a flaming fire by night. Upon all the glory shall be a defense. Does that draw a picture for you of anything that you remember? Say of Israel in the promised land. And what did that cloud stand for? What did the pillar of fire stand for? It was God's presence and God's protection. Both were pictured with it. Remember how the cloud went and stood between Israel and the armies of Egypt? This is God's presence that is protecting us. This canopy, this kind of tips ahead to chapter 6, where God's glory fills the temple, his glory fills the earth, and the New Jerusalem. The most obvious thing about the New Jerusalem will be God's glory. The visible signs of God's glory in this New Jerusalem. But then not only that, but then there's his protection in verse 6. This tabernacle or this tent for a shadow in the daytime, a place of refuge, and a covert from the storm. So there's 3 terms for shelter there. The shade from the sun, the shadow. A place of refuge would be a refuge from their enemies, a stronger place to hide. And then there's the end, this shelter from the storm that God is providing. So 3 chapters, we'll just wrap it up. Chapters 2, 3, and 4. One theme, the New Jerusalem will be glorious. Why does God have to build a New Jerusalem? Because the current one is corrupt and sinful, and God has to demolish it in order to rebuild. God judges sin. God judges rebellion. God must. And God has a plan to rebuild. How does God judge sin today? Well, there's 2 choices. One is Jesus already paid for the judgment of sin. He died, and he paid the ultimate price for sin. How do we have him pay for it? You trust him. Whoever believes in him, in me, will not perish, but will have everlasting life. The other choice is to do what Israel chose to do, what Judah chose to do, continue rebelling, and they paid with their lives. And that's a sad choice to make when God has already provided for us. God gives us his grace. Chapter 5, as you look ahead for next week, read all of chapter 5 for next week. The first few verses, God did everything necessary to make this vineyard grow and productive, but they rejected his help. And I would ask you today, if God is in demolition mode in your building process, don't run from him. Don't rebel against him. Trust him and allow him to build something far greater. Let's take our hymnals again. 417. just sing the first verse of this, where we're living our lives for Jesus, with His powers living in us, flowing through us, all of our days, all our hours. 4:17 as we finish up. Let's stand as we sing. All for Jesus, all for Jesus, all my beings ransom ours, all my thoughts and words and doings, all my days and all my hours. All for Jesus, all for Jesus, all my days and all my hours. All for Jesus, all for Jesus, all my days and all my hours. Stay standing. I want you to consider, where are you and God in your relationship this morning? Are you rebelling against God? God is willing to take away everything from you to cause you to trust Him. I would encourage you to trust Him today. Believer, do you have friends that don't know Christ? Do you have friends that are running from Christ? Encourage them gently but firmly that their future is grim unless they trust Him as well. Dear Father, I pray that we would learn from these truths, learn from your lessons for Judah, that you are willing to do this in our own lives. But thank you most of all that you've already sent your Son to take your wrath, to absorb it for us, so that we can trust Him and be forgiven, to be saved forever. Help us to rejoice in that this week. In Jesus' name, amen. You're dismissed.